Welcome. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something a little different tonight. Not noise, not urgency, just something calm and interesting to rest your mind on as the day winds down. That's exactly what this is. Over the next few hours, we're going to take a slow, unhurried journey through one of the most remarkable stories in human history, the story of commercial aviation. From a single wooden aircraft crossing a quiet bay in Florida in 1914, all the way through the jet age, the jumbo era, and into the present day, where billions of people take to the sky each year as naturally as catching a train. Every chapter of this documentary is written to be gentle on the mind. There are no sudden sounds, no dramatic music stings, no urgent pacing, just a quiet voice moving steadily through the decades, telling the story of how human beings learn to carry one another through the sky. Whether you make it all the way to the end or drift off somewhere over the Atlantic in 1958, that's perfectly fine. This video will be here whenever you need it. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of content, long, calm, history-focused documentaries designed for relaxing or sleeping to, it would mean a great deal if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small thing, but it helps more people find their way here, and it allows us to keep making content like this for you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to spend a little of your evening with this story. Now, find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. And let's begin. Chapter 1. Early Beginnings. Before airports, before jet engines, before flight attendants and boarding passes, there was a wooden wing, a patch of sand, and a quiet idea that humans might rise into the air. Tonight, we begin where commercial aviation began, with fragile machines, grass airfields, and the first brave passengers who trusted canvas and wire to carry them forward. Take a slow breath. Let yourself settle in. What you are about to hear is the story of one of humanity's greatest achievements, told gently, unhurriedly, from the very beginning. We are going back more than a century, back to a world without terminals, without radar, without any of the systems we now take entirely for granted. A world where the sky was still a frontier, and the men and women who reached toward it were doing something that most people, just a few years before, had believed was simply impossible. This is where it all begins. The year is 1914. The place is the western coast of Florida, where two small cities sit on either side of Tampa Bay. St. Petersburg on one shore, Tampa on the other. By land, the journey between them takes several hours. By water, it is not much better. But on the first day of January, in that new year, something remarkable happens. A small aircraft lifts from the surface of the water at St. Petersburg, climbs into the pale morning air, crosses the bay, and lands in Tampa. The entire flight lasts just 23 minutes. This is the first scheduled commercial airline flight in history. The aircraft is called the Benoist F-14, and it is a flying boat, meaning it is designed to take off from and land on water. Its hull shaped something like a shallow canoe, with wide fabric wings stretched out on either side. It is an open craft, entirely exposed to the wind and the air, with a single engine mounted above the fuselage and a wooden propeller spinning behind the pilot's seat. There is room for exactly one passenger. That first passenger is a man named Abram File, the former mayor of St. Petersburg, who pays the sum of $400 for his seat, a price set by public auction, a gesture meant to mark the occasion as the historic moment everyone present seemed to understand it to be. The pilot is Tony Janis, 25 years old, experienced, calm, and precise. He guides the little aircraft across the bay without incident, and when he touches down in Tampa, a small crowd is there to greet him. The St. Petersburg-Tampa airboat line runs for several months, completing scheduled flights across the bay and charging ordinary passengers $5 a trip, the equivalent of a very reasonable fare for the time. It is a novelty, yes, a wonder. But it is also something more. It is proof that a scheduled air service can work, that passengers will come, that the sky, at least in a small way, has opened for business. But the Benoist 14 itself is worth pausing on for a moment, because it tells us something important about how far aviation had come in just a little over a decade, and how far it still had to go. The aircraft is built almost entirely of wood and fabric. The wings are covered in cloth, stretched taut over a lightweight frame, and treated with a chemical compound to stiffen the surface and help it hold its shape against the wind. The whole structure weighs very little. It has to. The engine, a Roberts 6-cylinder unit, produces only about 75 horsepower, about the same as a modest automobile of the era. With that power, it can carry the pilot and a single passenger across calm water, in fair weather, at speeds not much greater than a fast automobile on a flat road. There are no instruments to speak of. No altimeter, no artificial horizon, no radio of any kind. The pilot reads the wind by feel, watches the surface of the water below, and listens to the engine. Everything is immediate. Everything is sensory. Flight in this era is an act of sustained, careful attention. Settle in your mind. The single seat beside the pilot. The warm Florida air moving past your face. The bay spread wide and silver below you. The sound of the engine, loud and mechanical, filling the air around you. And beneath your feet, only wood and canvas, and 20 or 30 feet of open sky. For several years after that first flight across Tampa Bay, aviation remains mostly a spectacle. Air shows draw crowds. Daring pilots loop and roll over fairgrounds. The machines improve, slowly, but the idea of regular passenger service, reliable, affordable, accessible, is still more dream than reality. What changes everything, in the years that follow, is mail. The post office, it turns out, needs a faster way to move letters across a vast country. The railroads are fast for their era, but the distances involved in crossing the United States are enormous. A letter sent from New York to California might take days by train. The idea begins to take shape. What if the mail could fly? In 1918, the United States Airmail Service launches regular flights. At first, the routes are short. The equipment is unreliable, The pilots are young men who had learned to fly during the First World War, accustomed to pushing aircraft to their limits, and accustomed too to the very real possibility that something might go wrong. And things do go wrong, frequently. Early airmail flying is extraordinarily dangerous. The routes cross mountains and plains and desert. The weather is unpredictable. The aircraft are temperamental. Navigation aids, as we understand them today, do not yet exist. But the mail keeps moving. And as the mail moves, something else happens, quietly and almost invisibly. The airlines, the small, scrappy companies flying these routes, begin to learn. They learn how to maintain aircraft more reliably. They learn how to plan routes more carefully. They learn how to manage the thousand small details that turn fragile flying machines into something approaching a dependable service. The passengers will come later, but first, the mail teaches aviation how to keep a schedule. How do you find your way across an unfamiliar landscape when you are moving at 100 miles an hour, 1,000 feet above the ground, with no radio and no instruments worth trusting? The early airmail pilots had a simple answer: you look down. Rivers are some of the oldest roads in the world. They run from high ground to low, from inland to the sea, and they have names and shapes that can be matched to a map. A pilot who knew his route knew which river bent which way, which town sat at which confluence, which stretch of water meant he was on course, and which meant he had drifted. Railroads were even better. The great rail lines of the early 20th century ran in long, deliberate curves across the American landscape, connecting cities that any educated person could name. Follow the right set of tracks, and you followed the right route. The locomotives below, trailing their plumes of smoke, were landmarks in motion, reassuring proof that the world beneath you was the world you expected. This method of navigation had a name. Pilots called it flying by the iron compass. It was imprecise. It was vulnerable to cloud cover and darkness, and the occasional rural landscape where one field looked very much like another. But it worked well enough, in the daylight, in reasonable weather, to carry the mail and keep the routes running. And then, as the 1920s progressed, something remarkable was added to the landscape. Across the United States, along the great airways that the government was slowly establishing, concrete towers began to appear in open fields. Each tower was topped with a rotating beacon, its light powerful enough to be seen for miles in clear air. Painted on the concrete base of each tower was a large arrow pointing toward the next beacon along the route. The towers were numbered. Positioned at intervals of roughly 10 miles, they created a chai, N of light stretching across the continent. For the first time, it became possible to fly at night. The lighted airways transformed aviation. A pilot who had been limited to the hours between sunrise and sunset could now carry the mail through the darkness, arriving in distant cities before dawn. Schedules compressed. Routes became more efficient. The country grew, in a practical sense, a little smaller. And somewhere in the mind of every traveler who watched those distant lights blinking slowly across the night sky, a quiet idea was taking shape. If a pilot could follow those lights to the next city, perhaps a passenger could follow along as well. By the mid-1920s, the airfields where pilots landed their mail planes are modest places. Most are simply grass strips, flat expanses of open field, wide enough for an aircraft to land in one direction and take off in another. There may be a small wooden building at the edge of the field where the mail is sorted and loaded. There may be a fuel tank and a mechanic. In most cases, there is not much else. The runway, as we now understand it, a long, paved surface precisely engineered for aircraft of specific weights and speeds, does not yet exist in most places. The grass must be kept mown. It must be dry enough to support the weight of an aircraft on its wheels. When it rains heavily, it turns to mud, and flights are delayed or canceled. The airfield is a place of informality and improvisation. Boundaries are loosely defined. The public sometimes wanders close. Aircraft are wheeled in and out of canvas hangars by hand. The smell of engine oil and aviation fuel hangs in the air. There is something quietly beautiful about those early airfields, seen from a distance of a century. They are humble places, unpretentious, still connected to the earth in a way that the great airports of later decades would not be. The grass is real grass. The sky above is the same sky the Wright brothers looked up at. Everything is still close to the beginning. Into this world, in the latter half of the 1920s, comes an aircraft that will change the way people think about flying for passengers. The Ford Trimotor arrives not with the fragility of the early flying boats, or the improvised energy of the mail planes, but with something new: solidity, confidence, the suggestion that air travel might be, if not entirely comfortable, then at least reasonably reliable. The Trimotor is built, as its name suggests, by the Ford Motor Company, the same company that had transformed the American automobile industry, that had made mass production a household concept, that carried with it a reputation for practical engineering and dependable machinery. When Henry Ford put his name on an aircraft, people noticed. The aircraft is constructed largely of corrugated aluminum, a material that gives it a distinctive ridged appearance, functional rather than graceful, but impressively robust for its time. It sits on fixed landing gear, with 3 engines, one mounted on the nose, and one beneath each wing. 3 engines meant that if one failed, and engines in this era failed with some regularity, the aircraft could continue flying on the remaining 2. This was not a small thing. Reliability was the great challenge of early aviation, and the Trimotor's redundancy was a genuine advancement. It could carry between 8 and 14 passengers, depending on the configuration, in a cabin that was enclosed, fully enclosed, with windows and seats and a degree of separation from the elements that earlier aircraft had not offered. And yet the experience inside was far from what we would today call comfortable. Step inside the cabin of a Ford Trimotor, and the first thing you notice is the noise. The 3 engines are close. Their sound fills the interior completely, a deep, sustained roar that makes conversation almost impossible without leaning close and raising your voice. Smitted through the airframe and into the seats and the floor beneath your feet. Everything rattles slightly. The windows are small, and the view is partial. The cabin is not pressurized. This means that at the altitudes the trimotor flies, generally below 10,000 feet, the air outside is essentially the same as the air inside, minus a bit of warmth. In winter, the cabin is cold. Passengers wrap themselves in blankets provided by the airline. Some wear heavy coats, some wear scarves. A few, on the earlier and more open aircraft of the decade before, had worn goggles, not as an affectation, but as a practical necessity against the wind. There is no air conditioning in summer. There is often turbulence, because the trimotor flies at low altitudes where weather is most active, and there are no weather radar systems, no forecasting tools of any sophistication to tell the pilot what lies ahead. When the air roughens, it roughens without warning, and the passengers hold on. The lavatory situation is best left to the imagination. And yet, people flew. They paid for tickets, boarded these aircraft, settled into their wicker seats, and flew. Because even with all of its discomforts, the trimotor did something that nothing else could do. It moved people through the air, across distances that would have taken days by train, in a matter of hours. The discomfort was the price, and for many passengers, it was a price worth paying. We are still in the early years now, still in the era of grass fields and iron compasses, and cabins full of engine noise. But something is stirring beneath all of it, a restlessness, an energy, a sense that aviation is moving towards something larger than anyone can quite yet see. The mail routes are expanding. The trimotor is proving that passengers will fly. The lighted airways are pushing the night back, opening new hours to the schedule. Small companies are forming, merging, finding routes, losing routes, surviving by thin margins and stubborn belief. Nobody in 1928 or 1929 knows what commercial aviation will look like in 10 years, or 20, or 50. Nobody can see the pressurized cabins, the transatlantic routes, the jets. What they can see is a grass field at dusk, a beacon blinking in the distance, and a single aircraft with 3 engines climbing away into the fading light. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. Let the sound of those early engines fade now. Let the grass field grow quiet. Let the beacon turn slowly in the darkness. You are resting now, and the story is just beginning. Ahead of you lie decades of invention and ambition, of tragedy and triumph, of aircraft that will grow larger and faster and quieter than anything these early pioneers could have imagined. But for now, let the 1920s settle around you like a quiet evening. The air is cool. Somewhere in the distance, a light is turning. Sleep gently. The history continues when you are ready. Chapter 2: The DC-3 Revolution. In the 1930s, something changed. Air travel stopped being an experiment. It became a business. A silver aircraft with twin propellers began to reshape the sky. It was called the DC-3. And for the first time, airlines could make money carrying people instead of mail. Settle in now. Let the weight of the day fall away. We are moving forward in our story, out of the grass fields and wooden airframes of the earliest years and into a new decade. A decade of chrome and ambition, of expanding routes and lengthening runways, of an aviation industry slowly finding its shape. The 1930s are not easy years for much of the world. The Great Depression has settled heavily across the United States and beyond. Money is scarce. Businesses are failing. And yet, in the hangars and drawing offices of the aircraft manufacturers, work continues. Because the people inside those buildings believe, with a conviction that does not waver even in hard times, that aviation has a future, and that the future belongs to whoever builds the right aircraft. In 1935, someone does. The Douglas Aircraft Company has been watching the airline industry carefully. They have seen the Ford Trimotor with its noise and its wicker seats, and its corrugated aluminum skin. They have seen the early Boeing and Curtiss aircraft that followed. They have listened to the airlines, particularly American Airlines, whose chief executive pushed hard for something better, something that could carry more passengers more comfortably over longer distances. What Douglas produces in response is the DC-3. It first flies in December of 1935, and from the moment it takes to the air, it is clear that something significant has happened. The aircraft is larger than its predecessors, cleaner in line, more powerful, more refined. It has 2 radial engines, dependable, proven designs, mounted in smooth nacelles beneath wings that sweep back with a gentle elegance that the corrugated trimotor never possessed. The fuselage is wide, the cabin is enclosed and insulated against some of the worst of the engine noise. The seats are real seats, cushioned, set beside windows that offer a proper view of the world below. It can carry around 21 passengers, and it can do something that no aircraft in regular commercial service has convincingly managed before. It can make money doing it. This point deserves a moment of quiet attention because it is easy to underestimate how important it is. Before the DC-3, airlines survived primarily because of the mail contracts. The government paid airlines to carry the post, and those payments subsidized the passenger routes that airlines also wanted to run. Passengers were important, but they were not in any strict financial sense sufficient. The numbers did not add up without the mail revenue sitting underneath them. The DC-3 changes the equation. Its combination of capacity, reliability, and operating efficiency means that an airline can fill its seats with paying passengers, charge a fare those passengers are willing to pay, and still, if they manage things carefully, turn a profit. For the first time in the history of commercial aviation, the passenger is not a supplement to the business model. The passenger is the business model. This is a transformation as significant in its way as the first flight itself. Because an industry that can sustain itself on passenger revenue is an industry that can grow. It can add routes. It can buy more aircraft. It can build the infrastructure, the terminals, the maintenance facilities, the reservation systems that a mature airline requires. The DC-3 does not just carry 21 people from one city to another. It carries the entire industry forward. By the late 1930s, something else is appearing on certain transcontinental routes that would have seemed extraordinary to the passengers who huddled under blankets in a Ford Trimotor just a decade before. Berths. On some of the longer overnight routes, airlines began offering passengers the option to recline fully, to sleep in something approximating a proper bed, suspended in the sky above the darkened American continent. The berths are narrow. This is not a luxury ocean liner, and space is finite, but they are real. Curtains provide a degree of privacy. The passenger can remove their shoes, pull a blanket over themselves, and drift towards sleep with the hum of the engines in the background and the lights of distant cities passing slowly below. It is by any measure an extraordinary thing, and it speaks to a shift in how the airlines are beginning to think about their passengers. Not just as cargo to be moved efficiently from one place to another, but as guests, people whose comfort and experience matter, whose willingness to fly again depends on whether this flight leaves them feeling they have been well looked after. The airline cabin is beginning, slowly, to become a place of service. And with service comes the question of who provides it. The role of the cabin attendant, what we now call the flight attendant, has its origins in these early years, and its origins are worth knowing because they reveal something about how aviation thought of itself and how it thought of its passengers. The first stewardesses, as they were known, began flying in 1930 with United Airlines, and the requirements for the position were specific, and by today's standards, remarkable. Candidates were required to be registered nurses. The reasoning was practical, if somewhat revealing of the era's anxieties about flight. Aviation was still understood by many potential passengers as a somewhat frightening undertaking, and having a trained medical professional on board was intended to reassure. If something went wrong, if a passenger became ill or panicked or needed medical attention at altitude, the stewardess could respond with professional competence. The weight limits applied to early flight attendants were enforced with equal strictness. This was partly a function of the aircraft themselves. Every pound on a small aircraft mattered, and the payload margins of early airliners were not generous. But it was also a function of the era's particular ideas about presentation, appearance, and what it meant to project an image of aviation as modern, controlled, and precise. The women who took these positions, and they were in these early years exclusively women, were stepping into something genuinely new. There was no established template for what a flight attendant was. They were creating the role as they performed it, managing the anxieties of nervous passengers, serving meals in cramped and sometimes turbulent conditions, maintaining a composure that the job required, even when the aircraft was moving through weather that would unsettle anyone. They were, in a quiet and underappreciated way, pioneers. While the DC-3 is reshaping domestic aviation across the United States, something else is happening across the oceans. Pan American Airways, Pan Am, as it becomes universally known, is in the business of thinking bigger than anyone else. Its founder and chief executive, Juan Trippi, is a man of restless ambition and extraordinary strategic vision. And what he wants in the 1930s is the world. Not the continental United States, the world. The challenge with flying across oceans is a simple one. Oceans are very wide, and an aircraft that runs out of fuel over water has no good options. The transatlantic distance from North America to Europe is roughly 3,000 miles at its narrowest. The trans-Pacific distance from California to Asia is far greater still. No aircraft of the early 1930s can manage these distances without stopping. And in mid-ocean, there is nowhere to stop. Unless, that is, you think about the problem differently. Juan Trippi's answer is the flying boat. An aircraft that does not need a runway. HAT can take off from and land on water. Can use the ocean itself as its airport. Islands scattered across the Pacific become refueling stations. Calm harbors in distant cities become terminals. The entire logic of the route changes when the aircraft can land on any sufficiently calm stretch of water. The aircraft Pan Am uses for its great oceanic routes is the Boeing 314 Clipper, and it is unlike anything flying at the time. The Clipper is enormous by the standards of the 1930s. A great silver machine with a hull shaped for the water and 4 powerful engines mounted high on a thick wing. Its range is extraordinary. It can fly from San Francisco to Honolulu, a distance of nearly 2,500 miles, and continue from there across the Pacific in stages, touching down in Midway, Wake Island, Guam, and finally Manila. It can cross the Atlantic with stops in Newfoundland and the Azores, or the Portuguese coast, arriving in Europe after a journey that is long and not always smooth, but that is possible. And inside the Clipper is an experience that the word airliner barely begins to cover. The Boeing 314 is configured for a level of comfort that the domestic airlines of the era cannot approach. Passengers dine in a proper dining room, seated at tables with linen and silverware. They sleep in private berths. There are separate areas for men and women, a lounge, a dressing room. The crew is large, professional, attentive. The passengers who ride the Clipper are wealthy. The fares are beyond the reach of ordinary people, and the journey takes days, not hours. But they are experiencing something that points, however distantly, toward the future. The idea that an aircraft can be not merely a means of transportation, but a destination in itself. That the journey across the sky can be, if done with sufficient care and ambition, genuinely wonderful. Then the 1930s end, and the 1940s begin, and the world changes entirely. War comes, and with war comes a transformation of aviation that no peacetime circumstance could have produced so quickly. The aircraft factories that have been building passenger liners begin building bombers and fighters and transport aircraft on a scale that strains comprehension. The aluminum and the engines and the engineers that might have gone into the next generation of airliners go instead into the war effort, and rightly so. The DC-3 does not disappear in these years. It transforms. Military planners look at the DC-3 and see exactly what the airlines have seen. A reliable, capacious, adaptable aircraft that can operate from rough airstrips in difficult conditions. They take the basic design, strengthen the floor for heavy cargo, add a large loading door, and produce the C-47 Skytrain, which the British call the Dakota, and which the soldiers who fly in it call by various nicknames that reflect both affection and the considerable discomfort of military air transport. The C-47 carries paratroopers into Normandy on D-Day. It supplies Allied forces across multiple theaters of the war. It flies over the Himalayas on the route that pilots call the Hump. carrying fuel and supplies into China under conditions of altitude and weather and mechanical strain that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the decade. Thousands of C-47s are built. Thousands of pilots learn to fly them. And then the war ends. In 1945, the world has more pilots than it knows what to do with. Young men trained at enormous expense and effort, who have flown in conditions that pre-war aviation could not have imagined, who are comfortable in the air in a way that would have taken peacetime decades to produce. And the world also has, suddenly available, thousands of surplus aircraft, C-47s, which is to say DC-3s, sitting on airfields across the globe, available for purchase at a fraction of what they cost to build. Small airlines spring up across the world, buying these surplus aircraft and opening routes in regions that had little or no air service before the war. Parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, the Caribbean. DC-3s begin to fly, connecting communities that no other form of transportation could easily reach. The aircraft that had been built for war becomes, in its hundreds and its thousands, the foundation of a global aviation network. Some of those DC-3s are still flying today, in remote corners of the world, on routes where the runway is short and the alternative is days of difficult travel. The aircraft that first flew in 1935 continues to do what it has always done. It carries people. It keeps its schedule. It runs. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. An aircraft designed in the depths of the Depression, first flown the year before the Spanish Civil War, converted for service in the largest conflict in human history, and then released into the post-war world to carry farmers and merchants and travelers across continents it was never originally designed to serve, and still, in some places, in the air. The DC-3 is not merely an aircraft. It is a testament to the possibility of getting something so fundamentally right that time itself cannot entirely retire it. Rest now. Let the engines of the clippers fade over the dark ocean. Let the C-47s settle onto their distant airstrips. Let the 1940s grow quiet around you. The world that comes next will be louder, faster, more ambitious still. The jet age is gathering on the horizon, though no one quite knows yet the shape it will take. New aircraft are already being imagined in drawing offices on both sides of a divided world. But that is for later. For now, let the silver DC-3 hold its place in the sky, steady, reliable, improbably enduring. Sleep well. Chapter 3. The Jet Age begins. Then came the sound, a low rising roar that did not belong to propellers. The age of the jet had arrived. Suddenly, oceans felt smaller, cities felt closer, and air travel began to feel like the future. Rest your body. Let your breathing slow. We are moving forward now into a new decade, a new sound, a new way of understanding what it means to move through the sky. The 1950s arrive in a world still reshaping itself after the war. Cities are being rebuilt. Economies are recovering. A generation of young people who spent their formative years in uniforms are now building careers, starting families, imagining futures that feel, for the first time in a long time, genuinely open. There is an energy in the post-war world, restless, optimistic, sometimes anxious, that finds its expression in 100 different places. In the suburbs going up on the edges of cities, in the automobiles growing longer and lower and more extravagant each year, in the rockets that both superpowers are beginning to point toward the sky, and in the jet engine. The jet engine is not entirely new by the time commercial aviation gets hold of it. Engineers in Britain and Germany had been working on the concept through the 1930s and into the war years. And by 1944, jet-powered military aircraft were flying in combat. The principle is elegant in its way. Rather than spinning a propeller through the air, a jet engine compresses incoming air, mixes it with fuel, ignites the mixture, and expels the resulting gases rearward at tremendous velocity. The aircraft is pushed forward not by the pull of a propeller, but by the thrust of its own exhaust. The result is speed and altitude. Jet engines operate most efficiently at high altitudes, where the air is thin and cold, and the aircraft can cruise far above the weather that makes low-altitude piston flying so unpredictable. Higher, faster, smoother. These are the promises of the jet engine. And in the early 1950s, a British aircraft manufacturer decides to make good on all of them. The de Havilland Company has a history of building elegant aircraft, and the Comet, their jet airliner, which enters commercial service in 1952, is no exception. It is a beautiful machine by any standard. Clean lines, 4 jet engines buried neatly in the roots of its swept wings, a cabin that is quieter and smoother than anything passengers have experienced before. It flies at altitudes and speeds that make the piston airliners it replaces seem, almost overnight, outdated. The airlines that begin operating the Comet attract passengers who are willing to pay for the experience. And the experience, in the early months of service, is genuinely remarkable. The aircraft climbs swiftly above the weather. The ride is smooth, still considerable by modern standards, but dramatically reduced compared to the roaring piston engines of the DC-3 era. Allows passengers to hold conversations without raising their voices. For those who have only known propeller-driven air travel, the Comet feels like stepping into the future. But beneath the beauty, something is wrong, something invisible, structural, not yet understood. The Comet is an aircraft designed at the edge of what engineers know. Flying at high altitude requires a pressurized cabin. The air outside at 30,000 feet is far too thin and cold to breathe, so the fuselage is sealed and pressurized to maintain conditions that passengers can tolerate. This pressurization creates a difference in air pressure between the inside of the aircraft and the outside. And that difference means that the fuselage is constantly being stressed, inflated slightly every time the aircraft climbs, deflated every time it descends. Every flight is a cycle of pressure and release. Engineers in the early 1950s understand this in principle. What they do not yet fully understand is how metal behaves under thousands and thousands of knuckles of cycles of this stress. How cracks can begin at the corners of windows, at riveted joints, at any point where the load is concentrated. and how those cracks can propagate with terrifying speed through the structure once they reach a certain length. In 1954, two comets come apart in flight. The investigations that follow are meticulous, painstaking, and in the end, enormously important. British researchers develop new methods of structural testing, submerging entire fuselages in tanks of water and pressurizing them repeatedly, using water rather than air, so that when a failure occurs, the energy is released slowly, rather than catastrophically. The testing reveals the truth about metal fatigue that the original design had not accounted for. The comet is grounded, redesigned, and eventually returns to service with structural modifications that address the problem. But the early commercial version has lost its lead, and the investigation's findings, now freely shared with the entire aviation industry, become the foundation on which every subsequent pressurized airliner is built. The tragedy of the comet's early failures is real. So is the lasting value of what those failures teach. Into the space that the comet's difficulties create steps a company that has spent the post-war years building jet-powered military tankers, learning the behavior of large swept-wing aircraft in ways that its commercial competitors have not yet had reason to explore. The Boeing 707 enters commercial service in 1958, and where the Comet was elegant, the 707 is imposing. It is larger, capable of carrying more passengers over longer distances. Its 4 engines hang in pods beneath the wings, a configuration that makes engine maintenance easier and, as engineers will later appreciate, keeps the heavy engines separated from the wing structure in ways that have important safety implications. It is loud. At full power on takeoff, it produces a sound that those who witness it in those early years describe as physical. A roar that can be felt in the chest, that rattles windows and buildings near the runway, that announces itself to anyone within several miles. But it flies, and it flies well, and it does something that changes the world. A transatlantic crossing that had taken the great piston airliners, the Constellations and Stratocruisers that represent the pinnacle of propeller-driven commercial flight, somewhere between 12 and 18 hours, depending on winds and stops, now takes the 707 roughly 7 hours from Newark to London, nearly half the time. The ocean has not shrunk, but the sky has deepened, opened, made itself available in ways it never quite was before. To fly at the altitudes the 707 prefers, 35,000 feet and above, passengers must be separated from the outside environment by more than just the aircraft's aluminum skin. The pressurized cabin, which the Comet had introduced, and which the Comet's disasters had taught the world how to build safely, becomes a standard feature of every jet airliner. And with it comes something that passengers notice immediately: smoothness. The weather that troubles low-altitude flight, the thunderstorms and turbulence and shifting winds that had made piston-era flying unpredictable, exists mostly below 30,000 feet. Jet airliners, cruising above it, ride a sky that is by comparison serene. The air at that altitude is extraordinarily cold and extraordinarily thin, but inside the pressurized cabin, the temperature is controlled, the pressure is maintained, and and the passenger sits in conditions that are essentially those of a mild and temperate day. This is not a minor comfort. It is a transformation. Passengers who had been warned by well-meaning friends that flying was rough, unpredictable, not suitable for those with delicate constitutions, board the new jets and discover that the sky, up here, is almost perfectly still. The clouds are below them, spread out like a white Conti net. The sun above is brilliant and unwavering. Many passengers in these early jet years find themselves pressing their faces to the small oval windows and simply looking. On the ground, the arrival of the jets creates an urgent problem. The airports that have served aviation up to this point are, in many cases, simply not ready. The runways are not long enough. The terminals are not large enough. The fuel supplies, the maintenance facilities, the passenger handling systems, all of it has been built for aircraft that are smaller and slower and carry fewer people than the new jets. Expansion begins immediately, and it is expansion on a scale that transforms the areas around major airports almost beyond recognition. Runways are extended, often requiring the acquisition of land and the demolition of whatever happened to exist at the end of the existing pavement. New terminals rise, some of them designed by architects who understand that the jet age calls for a new kind of building, something that reflects the speed and ambition of the machines it serves. Idlewild in New York, which will eventually become John F. Kennedy International Airport, is rebuilt around this period into a complex of separate airline terminals, each one distinctive, some of them architecturally extraordinary. Eero Saarinen designs the TWA terminal with sweeping concrete curves that suggest a bird in flight. The building is a statement about what the jet age means, not merely speed, but transformation. Not merely travel, but arrival into a future that looks genuinely different from everything that came before. And yet, in these same years, the aircraft themselves are producing something that will eventually require its own transformation. The early jet engines are loud in a way that goes beyond the inconvenience of noise. They are loud in a way that is measurable in hearing loss, in the disruption of neighborhoods, in the complaints of communities around airports, who find that the coming of the jet age has brought not just prosperity and connection, but a new kind of intrusion into daily life. The technology that will eventually address this, the high bypass turbofan engine that routes large volumes of air around the combustion core and dramatically reduces the noise signature, is still years away. For now, the jets announce themselves without apology. Their sound is the sound of the 1950s and 1960s, meeting each other at full speed. The airspace through which these jets now move is, in these years, being organized with new tools. Radar, developed for military purposes during the war and gradually extended to civilian applications, begins to give air traffic controllers something they have never had before: the ability to see where aircraft actually are, in something approaching real time, regardless of weather or visibility conditions. Before radar, controllers had worked from position reports, pilots radioing in their location, their altitude, their estimated time to the next waypoint, and controllers plotting these reports on paper and building a mental picture of the traffic in their sector. It was a system that worked, but it required wide separation between aircraft and a considerable degree of trust in the accuracy of the reports. Radar changes the picture. Now the controller can watch the blips move across the screen, can see when an aircraft is off its expected track, can identify conflicts before they develop, and redirect traffic with a precision that position reports alone could never provide. The sky, which has been growing steadily more crowded as more airlines put more aircraft into service, becomes for the first time genuinely manageable as a complex shared space. The work of air traffic control in these years is demanding and often stressful. The traffic is growing faster than the systems can comfortably handle, and the stakes of any error are absolute. But the introduction of radar is a genuine step forward, one of the enabling technologies without which the expansion of jet aviation would simply not have been possible. Inside the aircraft, the 1960s bring their own kind of transformation. The flight attendant, still primarily female, still subject to restrictions on weight and age and marital status that would be unthinkable today, becomes something new in the jet age. The airlines, in fierce competition for passengers, begin to understand that the cabin experience is a marketing opportunity, and the flight attendant is at the center of it. Uniforms are designed by fashion houses. In-flight service is choreographed and rehearsed. The image projected by the cabin crew is meant to embody the airline's brand, its personality, its promise, its particular version of what flying should feel like. This is not, by today's standards, an uncomplicated story. The way airlines marketed their flight attendants in the 1960s, the emphasis on youth and appearance, the advertising that treated them as part of the glamour being sold, rather than the professionals doing a demanding job, reflects values of the era that deserve honest acknowledgement. The women doing this work were skilled, trained, and often performing their duties under conditions of considerable physical and emotional difficulty. The gap between how they were depicted and what they actually did was wide. But within those constraints, something genuine was also happening. The flight attendant of the jet age was a figure who represented aviation to the public in a direct, personal way. She, and gradually in the later years of the decade, he, was the human face of an industry in transformation, present in the moment when the abstract promise of air travel became a specific, personal experience for each passenger who climbed the stairs and found a seat. And those passengers, by the 1960s, are no longer exclusively wealthy. The jet age does not arrive cheaply. In the early years of 707 service, a transatlantic ticket is still an expensive proposition, enough to represent a significant sum for a working family. But the economics of the jet favor scale. Larger aircraft carrying more passengers can spread costs across more seats, and as competition between airlines increases and the routes become more established, the fares begin to fall. Not dramatically, not yet. The full democratization of air travel is still some years away, but enough that the category of people for whom international flight is conceivable begins to expand. A businessman who would have taken a ship to Europe in 1950 now flies. A young couple saving for a special trip can, by the mid-1960s, consider the possibility of crossing an ocean by air without it being entirely beyond their means, which, for most of human history, has meant either wealth or necessity, begins to suggest itself as something else, an aspiration, a horizon, a thing that might, with planning and patience, be reached. The jet does not just shrink the world for the people already accustomed to crossing it. It begins quietly and imperfectly and unevenly to make the world available to people for whom it had never really been available before. Let that thought carry you gently forward. The engine's quiet now. The altitude holds. The pressurized cabin wraps its comfortable air around you. Below, the clouds spread out like a slow white sea, and above, the sky is the deep and particular blue that only exists above 30,000 feet. The jet age is here. The world is smaller than it was, and the story of how it got smaller still, of the wide-bodied aircraft and the deregulated skies and the routes that now connect every corner of the earth, is waiting for you on the other side of sleep. Chapter 4: The Jumbo Jet Era. In 1970, an aircraft appeared that seemed impossibly large. It had a second deck, a spiral staircase, a presence that changed every airport it visited. The jumbo jet did more than carry passengers. It carried the world closer together. Let yourself settle a little deeper now. The story we are telling tonight has been building steadily, from grass fields and flying boats, through the silver revolution of the DC-3, up into the high clean air of the first jets. Each chapter has carried us forward in time, and each one has brought aviation a little closer to the shape we recognize today. But the chapter we are entering now is different in scale from everything that came before it. Because in 1970, someone builds an aircraft so large that it changes not just the economics of air travel, but the experience of airports, the possibilities of international connection, and the very image of what a flying machine can be. The aircraft is the Boeing 747, and the first time most people see one, really see one, standing beside it on an apron or watching it lift from a runway, their reaction is the same. It cannot possibly be real. It is too large, too wide, too tall. It belongs to a category that the eye has no previous experience to measure it against. And yet it flies. The story of the 747 begins not with passengers, but with cargo. And not with Boeing alone, but with a competition that Boeing loses. In the mid-1960s, the United States Air Force is looking for a very large military transport aircraft, something capable of carrying enormous payloads over intercontinental distances, a kind of airborne freight train for the logistics of a superpower. Both Boeing and Lockheed submit designs. Lockheed wins, producing what becomes the C-5 Galaxy. Boeing, having invested enormously in its proposal, finds itself with a design team of extraordinary capability, a body of engineering knowledge about very large aircraft, and no military contract. Juan Trippe of Pan American Airways, who has never been a man to think small, sees what Boeing has and makes a proposal. He wants an aircraft twice the size of the 707, an aircraft that can carry so many passengers at such reduced cost per seat that transatlantic travel will become affordable to a far wider population than has ever considered it. He wants in essence to do for the jet age what the jet had done for the propeller era, to push the frontier of accessibility outward once more. Boeing agrees to build it. The project nearly destroys the company. The engineering challenges are immense, the costs extraordinary, the timelines brutal. But in February of 1969, the first 747 flies, and in January of 1970, Pan American puts it into commercial service between New York and London. Stand for a moment at the gate as that first aircraft is prepared for departure. The 747 is not merely larger than the aircraft around it. It is larger in a way that seems to belong to a different order of things entirely. Its tail rises 6 stories above the ground. Its fuselage is wide enough to contain 2 parallel aisles, with seats arranged in rows of up to 10 across. Its wings, fully loaded with fuel, flex noticeably under the weight, a detail that unnerves some early passengers, but is entirely within design limits, a deliberate expression of the engineering principle that a wing should bend rather than break. The upper deck sits behind and above the cockpit, accessed in early configurations by a spiral staircase near the front of the main cabin. In the first years of 747 service, airlines use this upper deck in various ways. Some configure it as a lounge, a separate, quieter space away from the main cabin where passengers can sit at small tables, have a drink, look out at the sky from a slightly elevated perspective. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to find on a commercial aircraft. A room within a room, a space designed not for transportation, but for the particular pleasure of being in the sky. The 747 can carry more than 350 passengers in early configurations, and significantly more as airlines eventually adopt denser seating arrangements. This capacity is the key to everything, because when you spread the costs of operating an aircraft across that many seats, the cost of each individual seat falls. And when the cost of each seat falls, the price of a ticket can follow. Not immediately, not uniformly, but in the direction that Tripp had always intended. There is a particular quality of sound associated with the 747 that those who flew on it in its early years often mention. The main cabin, wide and long and full, had a quality of ambient sound unlike anything that had come before in commercial aviation. The engines, hung far out on those enormous wings, were at a distance from the passenger that the narrower jets could not replicate. The width of the fuselage meant that the sound of the outside world was muffled and softened in ways that a narrower aircraft did not achieve. The overall impression was of a kind of insulated spaciousness, a sense that you were in a large, self-contained environment that happened to be moving through the upper atmosphere at 550 miles per hour. First-class passengers in the earliest 747 configurations experienced something that even the most premium travel of today rarely matches in terms of sheer spatial generosity. The upper deck lounge, the wide seats, the particular combination of altitude and speed in space, it was, for those who experienced it, genuinely memorable. The 747 did not just fly across oceans. It made the crossing feel, at its best, like an event worth having. And then, 3 years into the jumbo jet era, the world changes in a way that nobody in the aviation industry had fully anticipated. In October of 1973, the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed an oil embargo in response to Western support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The price of oil, which has been stable and relatively low for years, so stable that the airlines have built their entire economic planning around it, quadruples almost overnight. For the airlines, this is a crisis of the most immediate and practical kind. Aviation fuel is not a marginal cost. It is a foundational one. On many routes, fuel represents the single largest operating expense, and when that expense multiplies by 4 in the space of weeks, the financial models that the airlines have been using simply stop working. Routes that were profitable become unprofitable. Aircraft that were economical become expensive to operate. Expansion plans that seemed sensible are suddenly impossible. The industry contracts. Some airlines reduce their fleets, others cut routes. The 747s that were meant to democratize international travel find themselves, on some routes, flying with seats half empty because the fares required to cover costs have risen back toward the levels that restrict rather than expand access. The oil crisis does not kill the jumbo jet era, but it shapes it profoundly. It forces the airlines to think harder about efficiency than they ever have before. It accelerates research into more fuel-efficient engines, and it begins a process of structural rethinking about how routes should be organized, how passengers should be distributed across networks, how an airline can remain viable in a world where its largest single cost is suddenly and permanently unpredictable. One answer to the efficiency problem is a fundamental restructuring of how airlines think about their networks. For most of aviation's history, the dominant model has been relatively simple. An airline connects city A to city B with a direct flight. If it also serves city C, it flies from A to C directly as well. Routes are point-to-point connections, and the network is a map of those connections drawn across the landscape. In the years following the oil crisis, a different model begins to take hold: the hub and spoke network. The logic is elegant. Instead of flying direct routes between every pair of cities it serves, an airline concentrates its operations at one or several major hub airports. Passengers traveling between smaller cities are routed through the hub. They fly from their origin to the hub, change aircraft, and continue to their destination. The airline, meanwhile, can operate larger, more efficient aircraft on the heavily traveled routes between hubs, and smaller, more appropriate aircraft on the thinner routes connecting smaller cities to those hubs. The result is a network that can serve many more destinations than a purely point-to-point system, while concentrating enough traffic on the core routes to keep the large aircraft profitably filled. It is a system that requires coordination. The timing of arrivals and departures at the hub must be synchronized, so that passengers making connections can do so without spending unreasonable amounts of time waiting. But it is a system that, once established, has a powerful internal logic. The hub airport in this model becomes something it has never been before. Not merely a place where flights happen to land, but the organizing center of an entire network. A place through which traffic flows as through a heart. In 1978, the United States government makes a decision that will reshape commercial aviation more profoundly than any single aircraft or technology. The Airline Deregulation Act removes federal control over airline routes and fares. Before deregulation, the Civil Aeronautics Board had determined which airlines could fly which routes, and had approved the fares those airlines could charge. The system had created stability of a kind. Passengers knew what to expect. Airlines operated within known parameters. But it had also insulated the industry from the competitive pressures that in other industries drive innovation and cost reduction. After deregulation, airlines can fly wherever they can make a business case for flying, and charge whatever the market will bear. The effect is immediate and dramatic. New airlines appear, attracted by the opportunity to compete on routes previously protected by the old system. Established airlines, suddenly exposed to competition they have never faced before, begin a process of restructuring, cost-cutting, and strategic repositioning that will continue for decades. Fares fall on competitive routes as airlines undercut each other to fill seats. They rise on routes where one airline has a dominant position and faces little pressure to reduce prices. The geography of air travel in the United States is redrawn, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, by the simple application of competitive economics to an industry that had previously been shielded from them. And out of this newly competitive landscape, a new kind of airline begins to emerge: the low-cost carrier, an airline built from the ground up around the principle of minimizing operating costs and passing the savings to passengers in the form of lower fares, is not an entirely new idea when deregulation arrives. Southwest Airlines, which will become the model that low-cost carriers around the world attempt to replicate, has been operating within Texas since 1971, flying between Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio on routes that, because they are entirely within a single state, had been outside the federal regulatory system. Southwest's model is built on a set of principles that seem simple in retrospect, but are revolutionary in the context of an industry accustomed to the old way of doing things. Fly only one type of aircraft, the Boeing 737, so that training, maintenance, and spare parts can be standardized and simplified. Turn aircraft around at the gate as quickly as possible, because an aircraft sitting on the ground is not generating revenue. Offer a single class of service, no seat assignments, no meals. Tea and the flight. Keep everything else as lean as it can possibly be. The fares that this model produces are low enough to attract passengers who would not otherwise have considered flying. People who would have driven, or taken a bus, or simply not made the journey at all, begin to appear at Southwest's gates. The airline is not just competing with other airlines, it is competing with the automobile, and it is winning. After deregulation opens the rest of the country to this model, the effects begin to ripple outward. Other low-cost carriers appear. The established airlines struggle to compete, while carrying cost structures built for a regulated world. The price of flying, on routes where competition exists, continues its long drift downward towards something that a widening circle of people can actually afford. All of this, the hub networks, The new airlines, the falling fares, the growing traffic creates an administrative challenge that the old systems of handwritten tickets and paper reservation books cannot begin to address. The computerized reservation system arrives in this era not as a luxury, but as a necessity. American Airlines Sabre system, which has been developing since the 1960s in partnership with IBM, becomes by the 1970s a system of genuine complexity and power. A network connecting thousands of travel agents to a central database of flights, seats, and fares, capable of making a booking and confirming it in seconds. For the traveler, this transformation is largely invisible. You call your travel agent. She checks the screen, and your ticket is arranged. The extraordinary computational effort behind that simple transaction, the querying of databases, the real-time updating of seat inventories, the coordination of connecting flights and fare rules, happens out of sight. But for the industry, it is foundational. Without computerized reservation systems, the complexity of the hub-and-spoke network, with its connecting itineraries and its multiple fare classes and its constantly shifting availability, would be simply unmanageable. The computer does not just make booking more efficient, it makes the modern airline network possible. By the end of the 1980s, the world that these changes have created looks genuinely different from the world of 1970. More people are flying. Fares on competitive routes are lower in real terms than they have ever been. The 747 has made the crossing of oceans routine in a way that was once the province of the wealthy and the adventurous. Hub airports have grown into small cities of their own, with their terminals and their concourses and their particular compressed humanity of people in transit. And somewhere in all of this, in the efficiency gains and the price reductions and the expanding networks, the quiet promise that Juan Trippe made when he ordered the first 747 is beginning, imperfectly and unevenly, but genuinely, to be kept. The world is closer together, not for everyone, not yet, and not without complications, but closer than it was, reachable in ways it was not before. Let that closeness settle around you now, like warmth. The jumbo jets are cruising at altitude, their wide cabins carrying their hundreds of passengers through the dark above the ocean. The hub airports below are quiet in the small hours, their gates empty, their corridors lit and still. The computers that hold the reservations and the fares and the seat inventories are running their quiet calculations. Everything is in motion. Everything is connected. Sleep now. The modern age of aviation is very close, and it is waiting for you just ahead. Chapter 5: Modernization and Technology. Hook. By the 1990s, flying had become familiar, but beneath the calm cabin hum, technology was quietly transforming everything. Mechanical cables gave way to computers, paper tickets disappeared, and cockpits began to glow with digital light. By the 1990s, flying had become familiar, but beneath the calm cabin hum, technology was quietly transforming everything. Mechanical cables gave way to computers, paper tickets disappeared, and cockpits began to glow with digital light. Breathe slowly. Let the narrative carry you now as it has been carrying you through the decades, through the grass fields and the flying boats, through the silver revolution of the DC-3 and the thunder of the first jets, through the impossible scale of the jumbo era. We are moving into familiar territory now, years that many of us lived through, a world whose outlines we recognize. And yet the story of what was happening inside aviation during these years is no less extraordinary for being recent. The 1990s arrive in a world that has been flying commercially for nearly 80 years. The routines of air travel are well established. You book through a travel agent, receive a paper ticket, arrive at the airport, check in at a desk, staffed by a person with a keyboard and a boarding card printer, walk through a security checkpoint, find your gate, and board an aircraft whose basic configuration, rows of seats, overhead bins, a galley at each end, a cockpit separated from the cabin, would have been recognizable to a passenger from 20 years before. But look more carefully. Look at what is happening inside the aircraft itself, inside the systems that manage the flight, inside the cockpit where the pilots sit. Because the 1990s are years of quiet, profound transformation, and much of it is happening in places the passenger never sees. For most of aviation's history, the connection between the pilot and the aircraft's control surfaces, the ailerons, the elevators, the rudder, has been mechanical and direct. The pilot moves the control column or the rudder pedals, and cables and rods and pulleys transmit that movement physically through the airframe to the surfaces that control the aircraft's attitude and direction. It is a system of considerable elegance in its simplicity. The pilot's intention becomes, through a chain of physical connections, the aircraft's response. Fly-by-wire replaces that physical chain with electronics. The pilot still moves a control input, but instead of that movement being transmitted mechanically, it is converted into an electrical signal, processed by computers, and then transmitted to actuators that move the control surfaces. The mechanical connection between the pilot and the aircraft is broken. In its place is a computational layer, a set of flight control computers that receive the pilot's input, consider it in the context of the aircraft's current state, apply their own limits and corrections, and then command the surfaces to respond. The implications of this are profound and not immediately obvious. An aircraft with fly-by-wire flight controls can be designed with a different relationship between its natural aerodynamic stability and its performance envelope. A conventional aircraft must be inherently stable. It must tend to return to level flight on its own, because if it does not, a mechanical failure in the control system or a moment of pilot inattention could lead rapidly to catastrophe. This requirement for inherent stability places limits on how the aircraft can be designed, and those limits affect performance. A fly-by-wire aircraft can be designed to be aerodynamically unstable. It can be a machine that the computers must actively, constantly work to keep in controlled flight. Military fighter jets have exploited this for decades, achieving extraordinary maneuverability by accepting instability that only computers can manage quickly enough to count. ROL. For commercial aircraft, the application is different, but the principle opens new possibilities in design. And the computers add something else: protection. Fly-by-wire systems can be programmed with envelope limits, boundaries beyond which the aircraft will not go regardless of what the pilot commands. Bank the aircraft too steeply, pull too hard on the controls, approach a stall. The computers can intervene, moderate the input, keep the aircraft within the safe region of its flight envelope. For most flights, on most days, these protections are invisible. They operate in the background, unnoticed, but they are always there. The aircraft that brings fly-by-wire to the forefront of commercial aviation, that makes it visible, that makes it a subject of conversation, and eventually of near universal adoption, is the Airbus A320, which enters service in 1988 and comes into its own through the 1990s as one of the most commercially successful airliners ever built. The A320 is a narrow-body aircraft, a single-aisle jet designed for short to medium-haul routes, the kind of aircraft that forms the backbone of most airlines' fleets. In this category, it competes directly with the Boeing 737, which has been in service since the 1960s and which represents the accumulated experience and trust of decades of operation. What the A320 brings to this competition is not just fly-by-wire, but the glass cockpit. The traditional cockpit of a commercial airliner, familiar from the jets of the 60s and 70s, is a dense arrangement of individual instruments, each one dedicated to a specific function: the altimeter, the attitude indicator, the airspeed indicator, the engine instruments, the navigation displays. There are dozens of them, each with its own dial or gauge, each requiring the pilot's eye to find it and read it and interpret what it shows. The glass cockpit replaces these individual instruments with a small number of large electronic displays, each capable of showing different information depending on what the pilots need at a given moment. The same screen that shows the navigation picture can be reconfigured to show engine data or weather or system status. Information can be integrated and cross-referenced in ways that individual analog instruments cannot achieve. The pilots scan, the practiced movement of attention from instrument to instrument that takes years to develop and maintain, is simplified, consolidated, made more efficient. The A320's cockpit also introduces the side stick controller, replacing the conventional control column that stands between the pilot's legs, with a small joystick mounted at the side of the seat. The side stick takes up less space, improves the view of the instrument panel, and integrates naturally with the fly-by-wire system that interprets its inputs. For pilots transitioning from conventional aircraft, it requires adjustment. For those who train on it from the beginning, it quickly becomes simply the way an aircraft is flown. Through the 1990s, another quiet revolution in aviation's technical rules is opening possibilities that would otherwise have remained closed. For most of commercial aviation's history, the question of how far a twin-engine aircraft can fly has been constrained by a simple and sensible concern. If one engine fails over the open ocean, the aircraft must be able to reach a diversion airport within a reasonable time on the remaining engine. For many years, the limit is set at 60 minutes. A twin-engine commercial aircraft must never be more than 60 minutes of single-engine flying time from an adequate airport. This rule, known as ETOPS, Extended Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards, limits where twin-engine aircraft can go. Over the vast expanses of the Pacific, over remote stretches of the Atlantic, over the polar routes. The distance between adequate diversion airports can exceed what 60 minutes of single flying engine flight can cover. These routes, therefore, require aircraft with 3 or 4 engines. Aircraft like the 747, or the Lockheed L-1011, or the DC-10. But engines, through the 1980s and 90s, have become dramatically more reliable. The failure rates that justified the 60-minute rule have fallen to levels that make the original limits seem, in light of the data, overly conservative. Regulators begin to extend the limit, first to 120 minutes, then to 180 minutes, then beyond. Each extension is earned through data, through demonstrated reliability, through careful analysis of the actual risk involved. The beneficiary of this evolution is the twin-engine wide-body airliner. And the aircraft that most completely fulfills the promise of extended ETOPS rules is the Boeing 777. The 777 is large. It carries between 300 and 400 passengers depending on configuration, placing it between the narrow-body jets and the 747 in capacity. It has 2 engines, but 2 engines of a scale and power that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Its General Electric GE90 engines are the most powerful commercial jet engines ever built. Their fan blades so large that the intake of a single engine is wider than the fuselage of a 737. With ETOPS clearance, the 777 can fly routes that previously required 4-engine aircraft. Across the Pacific, over the poles, on the long thin routes that connect distant cities without enough traffic to fill a 747. The economics of twin-engine operation, which are more favorable than 4-engine operation in terms of fuel and maintenance, can now be applied to routes where they could not go before. Airlines begin retiring their 3- and 4-engine wide bodies, replacing them with pairs of twins. The 747, which had seemed in the 1970s like the permanent future of long-haul aviation, begins its long, slow, not yet complete retirement from passenger service. The twin-engine wide-body is the future, and the 777 is its most powerful early expression. On the ground through the 1990s, a different transformation is gathering speed. The internet arrives in the lives of ordinary people in the early years of the decade. Slowly at first, then with a velocity that surprises almost everyone. And among the first industries to feel its effects is aviation. Because aviation has something that the internet is perfectly suited to distribute. Information about flights, schedules, availability, and prices that previously required a travel agent or a telephone call to a reservation center to access. Online booking changes the relationship between the passenger and the airline in ways that go beyond mere convenience. When a passenger can see the available seats, compare the fares, and make a booking without speaking to anyone, the airline's pricing becomes visible and comparable in a way it has never been before. The passenger who previously might have accepted the first fare quoted can now, in a few minutes, see what every airline charges for the same journey on the same day. This transparency accelerates the pressure on fares. It empowers the passenger, and it begins a process of disintermediation. the gradual removal of the travel agent as a necessary middleman. That will, over the following decade, fundamentally change how airline tickets are sold and how airlines relate to their customers. The paper ticket, which has been the physical token of the passenger's right to a seat since the earliest days of commercial aviation, begins its long disappearance. The electronic ticket, a record in a database, confirmed by an email, verified at the airport by a passport or a booking reference, takes its place. The change is so complete and so rapid that by the mid-2000s, the paper ticket is essentially gone from most of commercial aviation. Vanished so thoroughly that younger travelers find it difficult to imagine it ever existed. Are developing a relationship with their most frequent passengers that has evolved into something considerably more complex than the simple exchange of a fare for a seat. Frequent flyer programs, which began in the early 1980s as relatively simple loyalty schemes, fly a certain number of miles, earn a free ticket, have by the 90s become sophisticated financial instruments. The miles that airlines award to their passengers have become a kind of currency, earned through flights but also through credit card spending, hotel stays, car rentals, and dozens of other transactions that have nothing directly to do with aviation. The airline sells miles to banks and retailers, who award them to customers as incentives. The passenger accumulates miles and redeems them for flights, upgrades, and other benefits. The airline manages the liability of outstanding miles, the seats it has promised but not yet provided, as a complex financial obligation on its balance sheet. For the passenger, the program creates loyalty, or something that functions like loyalty, an economic incentive to concentrate flying on one airline rather than distributing it across competitors. For the airline, it creates revenue that is detached from the actual provision of air travel, a financial stream that continues regardless of whether seats are full or fuel prices are manageable. In difficult years, the miles business is sometimes more profitable than the flying business. In September of 2001, everything changes. The attacks of that morning are not primarily an aviation story, and the weight of what they mean in human terms is not something to be compressed into a narrative about the history of air travel. But their effect on commercial aviation is total and immediate and permanent. Security procedures that had been in place for decades, procedures calibrated to one understanding of the threat, are replaced almost overnight with a new system built around a different and darker understanding. Passengers who had walked to their gates with minimal disruption now remove their shoes, empty their pockets, pass their bags through scanners of increasing sophistication, and submit to processes that are intrusive and time-consuming in ways that flying had never previously required. The checkpoint becomes a fundamental feature of the travel experience, unavoidable, extensive, a threshold that every passenger must cross between the ordinary world and the world of the aircraft. The time required to pass through security becomes a factor in journey planning in a way it never had been before. Airports redesign their terminal layouts to accommodate the new requirements. Entire industries emerge around the technology of detection and screening. The aviation security landscape of 2001 and the landscape of 1999 are separated not by 2 years, but by an absolute discontinuity, before and after, with no path back. In the years that follow, airports themselves continue their evolution towards something approaching self-service. The self-service kiosk appears at check-in areas across the world's airports through the early 2000s, and its effect is gradual but significant. Passengers who have already received their boarding pass via email can proceed directly to bag drop, or, for those traveling with only carry-on luggage, directly to a security checkpoint. The long queues at staff check-in desks, which had been a defining feature of the airport experience for decades, begin to shorten. This is convenient for the passenger and economical for the airline. But it is also part of a broader shift in the nature of the airport experience, a shift toward a relationship between the passenger and the institution that is mediated increasingly by screens and systems rather than by people. The human beings at the check-in desk are not disappearing entirely, but their role is changing, concentrating on the cases that require judgment and as assistance, rather than the routine processing of passengers with straightforward itineraries. High above the airports, on the aircraft themselves, two developments through these years are quietly improving the economics of every flight. Winglets, those upswept or angled extensions at the tips of aircraft wings that become increasingly common through the 90s and 2000s, address a problem that aerodynamicists have understood for decades. At the tip of any finite wing, the pressure difference between the upper and lower surface causes air to curl around the tip from below, creating a spiraling vortex that persists for miles behind the aircraft and constitutes a form of drag. This induced drag costs fuel. A winglet, by modifying the airflow at the tip, reduces the strength of the vortex and reduces the drag. The fuel savings from winglets are not dramatic on any single flight, perhaps 3 to 5%, depending on the aircraft and the route. But across thousands of flights, across an entire fleet, across a year of operations, 3 to 5% of fuel is an enormous quantity of money. Airlines retrofit existing aircraft with winglets. New aircraft are designed with them from the outset. The distinctive upswept tips become as characteristic of the modern airliner as the jet engine itself. And inside the aircraft structure, aluminum, which has been the dominant material of commercial aviation since the trimotor, begins to face competition from composite materials. Carbon fiber reinforced plastics and other advanced composites offer the possibility of structures that are lighter than aluminum for equivalent strength and that do not corrode in the way that metal does. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, which is in development through this period, will eventually fly with a fuselage that is more composite than metal, a departure from 8 decades of aluminum construction that represents a genuine shift in the materials from which the sky is built. The 1990s and 2000s are not the most dramatic decades in aviation's history. There is no single aircraft as transformative as the 707, or as immediately overwhelming as the 747. The changes of these years are quieter: digital, computational, procedural, material, and they are changes that accumulate rather than arriving at a single moment. But accumulation, in engineering as in most things, is how genuine transformation happens. The aircraft that emerges from this period of quiet advancement is safer, more efficient, more precisely managed, and more accessible to more people than anything that flew before it. The familiar hum of the cabin, which passengers settle into without much thought, is the sound of all of it working together. The fly-by-wire computers, the glass cockpit displays, the winglets bending the airflow, the database that holds the reservation and the security system that verified the passenger, and the fuel management system calculating the precise quantity required for this route in these winds at this altitude. All of it humming quietly, carrying you forward. Let that hum be the last thing you hear for a while. The aircraft is at altitude. The cabin lights are low. Outside the oval window, if you were to look, the stars would be very bright and very close, and the world below would be dark, except for the scattered lights of cities and towns, tracing the shapes of human habitation across the landscape. You have come a long way tonight, from a grass field in Florida to the upper atmosphere of the digital age. And still the story is not quite finished. There are wide-body twins and ultra-long-haul routes, and the question of what aviation becomes next, still waiting ahead. But those are questions for another moment. For now, let the cabin hold you. Let the engines do their work. Sleep well. The flight continues. Chapter 6: Global Expansion Era. The new century brought scale. Airports grew into cities. Aircraft grew into flying skyscrapers. And more people flew each year than ever before in human history. Commercial aviation became a global network stretching across every continent. Let yourself rest a little deeper now. The night is well along, and the story we have been telling has carried us through more than a century of human ambition. Through the grass fields of Florida and the flying boats of the Pacific. Through the thunder of the first jets and the impossible scale of the jumbo era. Through the quiet digital revolution of the 90s. We are close to the present now. The world we are entering is one that many of us inhabit. A world of touchscreens and instant booking, and airports that feel like small cities unto themselves. But before we arrive entirely in the familiar, there is still a chapter to be told. A chapter of extraordinary scale, of aircraft that push against the boundaries of what seems possible, of a global network that in the first 2 decades of the new century grows larger and more intricate and more deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary life than anyone in 1970 or 1985 or even 1995 could quite have imagined. In the late 1990s, 2 of the world's great aircraft manufacturers look at the future of commercial aviation and reach different conclusions. Boeing looks at the data on passenger traffic and concludes that the future belongs to efficiency and connectivity, that what airlines and passengers need is a fleet of medium to large aircraft capable of flying long distances between a wide variety of city pairs, connecting people directly without routing them through the great hubs. Point-to-point flying, made possible by aircraft with sufficient range and economy to make thin routes viable. The 787 Dreamliner is the expression of this vision. Airbus looks at the same data and concludes something different. It sees the great hub airports, Heathrow, Frankfurt, Singapore, Dubai, Tokyo, already operating at or near their capacity limits, It sees airlines trying to squeeze more passengers through constrained infrastructure, unable to add flights because the slots are full and the runways are saturated. And it concludes that the answer is not more flights, but bigger aircraft. That if you cannot add another departure, you make the departures you have larger, carrying more people per movement. The aircraft that expresses this vision is the Airbus A380, and it is by any measure a machine of extraordinary dimensions. The A380 enters commercial service in 2007, and its statistics are the kind that require a moment to absorb. It is a double-deck aircraft along most of its length, not merely a raised cockpit and a partial upper deck, as in the 747, but two full passenger decks, running from near the nose to near the tail, each one wide enough to contain a row of seats 10 or 11 across. In typical two-class configurations, it carries around 550 passengers. In high-density single-class arrangements, it can carry more than 800. Standing beside it at an airport gate, the A380 does not seem like an aircraft so much as a building that has decided, improbably, to fly. Its fuselage cross-section, viewed from the front, is enormous, wider and taller than anything that has preceded it in commercial service. Its wingspan is so great that some airports must modify their taxiways and gates to accommodate it. The engineering required to make it airworthy, to build a structure that strong, that light, that aerodynamically workable, represents one of the most demanding achievements in the history of commercial aircraft design. Airlines configure the A380 in ways that reflect their individual visions of what flying at this scale should mean. Some fill both decks with economy seating, maximizing the passenger count and the revenue potential of every flight. Erroneously, spreading business class across the forward upper deck, installing suites and private enclosed spaces that turn the upper level of a commercial airliner into something approaching a private club, accessible to passengers paying the premium fares that finance the aircraft's operating costs. Emirates, the Dubai-based carrier that becomes the A380's largest and most enthusiastic operator, installs shower spas in its first-class cabin. Not a mist spray, not a damp towel, an actual shower with hot water available to first-class passengers at 38,000 feet above the ocean. It is a detail that, when reported, tends to produce a particular kind of pause in the listener. The pause of someone recalibrating their sense of what is apparently possible in a commercial aircraft. Below the rarefied atmosphere of the upper deck first-class suite, the business class cabin is also undergoing a transformation through these years that represents a genuine step forward in the quality of long-haul travel. For most of commercial aviation's history, the distinction between cabin classes has been primarily a matter of seat width, seat pitch, the distance between your seat and the one in front, and the quality of the meal service. Business class passengers had wider seats and more legroom and better food than economy passengers. First class passengers had still more of all three, but everyone, regardless of class, sat in a seat that reclined to some angle and then stopped, leaving the passenger to sleep as best they could in something that was ultimately still a chair. The lie-flat business class seat changes this. It is exactly what it sounds like. A seat that converts into a surface flat enough to sleep on horizontally, long enough to accommodate a full-grown adult, private enough to feel genuinely restful. The first lie-flat seats appear in the late 90s. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, they spread across the long-haul fleets of airlines around the world, becoming first a luxury, then a differentiator, then on competitive international routes, essentially the expected standard for business class travel. The engineering of a lie-flat seat in a commercial aircraft cabin is not a simple thing. The seat must convert reliably, withstand the rigors of constant use by thousands of passengers, fit within a fuselage cross-section that limits the available space, meet stringent safety standards, and still feel, in its reclined position, comfortable enough to actually allow sleep. The solutions that different manufacturers and airlines develop vary considerably. Some seats align with the aircraft's axis when flat. Others angle slightly. Still others face backward or forward, or alternate in herringbone arrangements that maximize privacy and density simultaneously. For passengers making long overnight flights across oceans, from London to Singapore, from New York to Dubai, from Los Angeles to Sydney, the difference between a lie-flat bed and a reclining seat is not a minor amenity. It is the difference between arriving rested and arriving exhausted. And airlines that get this right find that business class passengers will choose them specifically for the quality of their sleep. In economy class, which is where the vast majority of the world's air passengers have always traveled and continue to travel, a different kind of improvement is accumulating through these years. The in-flight entertainment system, which began as a single film projected on a screen at the front of the cabin, visible to those with good seats and good eyesight, invisible to anyone seated too far back or at too wide an angle, has evolved through seatback screens mounted on the back of every seat in front of you, through on-demand systems that let each passenger choose their own content rather than watching whatever the airline has scheduled. And by the 2000s, into systems of genuine quality and variety. In the 2010s, can choose from hundreds of films, dozens of television series, music playlists, games, flight information displays that show the aircraft's position on a moving map, the altitude, the outside temperature, the time remaining to destination. The screen is touch sensitive. The headphones are noise canceling or close to it. The content library is updated regularly. This is not a trivial change. Long flights have always been, for most passengers, primarily an exercise in endurance, in finding ways to pass the hours between takeoff and landing. The quality of in-flight entertainment does not make a 12-hour flight into something actively enjoyable for everyone, but it makes it genuinely more manageable. It shrinks the subjective experience of time in ways that matter. Outside the aircraft, looking down, the technology guiding the flight has also changed in ways that are profound but largely invisible to the passenger. The great radio navigation systems that guided commercial aviation through the middle decades of the 20th century, the beacons and the airways and the intricate ground-based network that told pilots where they were in relation to the infrastructure below, gave way through the 90s and accelerating through the 2000s to GPS. The Global Positioning System, developed by the United States military and made available for civilian use, allows an aircraft's navigation computers to know their position to within meters, at any point on the globe, at any altitude, in any weather, at any time. The vast network of ground-based navigation aids is not immediately redundant. Aviation is conservative about removing backup systems, but the primary means of determining where an aircraft is becomes almost universally the satellite. This matters for efficiency in ways that are not always obvious. When aircraft navigate by ground-based aids, they must follow airways, defined tracks in the sky that connect the ground stations, like roads between cities. The most direct route between 2 points is rarely available, because the airways do not align with it. GPS navigation allows aircraft to fly more direct routes, to take the shorter path rather than the one that happens to pass over the right ground station. And over the distances involved in international flying, more direct routes mean less fuel, less time, and lower costs. GPS also enables more precise approach procedures that allow aircraft to land in conditions of lower visibility than older systems permitted, reducing the weather-related delays and diversions that have always been one of aviation's most disruptive and expensive unpredictabilities. Real-time aircraft tracking, the ability to know at any moment exactly where any given commercial aircraft is, becomes during these years a standard feature of the aviation landscape, though its implementation is more complicated than the phrase suggests. Over land, radar coverage is generally comprehensive. Ground-based radar systems track aircraft continuously, and the position data flows into air traffic management systems in near real time. The radar picture on an air traffic controller's screen is a faithful representation of where the traffic actually is. Over oceans, it is different. Radar cannot reach across thousands of miles of open water. For most of commercial aviation's history, oceanic flights have been tracked through position reports. Pilots radioing their position at defined waypoints, controllers plotting those reports, and building an approximate picture of where the traffic is. It is a system of reasonable reliability but limited precision, requiring wide separations between aircraft because the controller cannot see the actual picture. Satellite-based surveillance systems begin changing this through the 2000s and accelerating into the 2010s. Aircraft transponders that broadcast their position via satellite, systems that pick up and relay those broadcasts to ground stations around the world, gradually extend the radar picture over the oceans and the polar routes and the remote regions where ground radar has never reached. The coverage is not yet universal as the decade turns, but it is extending steadily. The gaps that remain in global surveillance become tragically visible during this period, in episodes that demonstrate what the absence of real-time tracking means for a missing aircraft. But those episodes also accelerate the push toward complete global coverage, a goal that, by the latter part of the 2010s, is substantially closer to being achieved. The aircraft being delivered during these years are pushing the boundaries of range in ways that redefine what an airline route can be. Ultra-long-haul flying, routes of 16, 17, 18 hours or more, operated non-stop between distant city pairs, becomes viable during this period, as engines and airframes and fuel systems improve, to the point where the distances involved, which once required intermediate stops, can be covered in a single sustained flight. Singapore Airlines operates a non-stop service between Singapore and New York, one of the longest commercial routes in the world, using an aircraft configured specifically for the purpose, with additional fuel capacity and a relatively low passenger density that keeps the weight manageable over those extraordinary distances. Other airlines develop their own ultra-long-haul operations, connecting city pairs in Australia and Europe, in the Gulf and the Americas, that previously could not have been served without a stop. For the passenger on such a flight, the experience is its own particular thing. 18 hours is a long time to be in any enclosed space, however well appointed. The body's rhythms become uncertain. Multiple time zones are crossed. The distinction between day and night outside the window shifts and reverses. Sleep and waking lose their normal relationship to the light. Meals are served at times that bear no clear relationship to appetite. And yet there is something in the non-stop flight that passengers value beyond the time saved. The absence of a connection, of a transfer through an intermediate airport, of the disruption and uncertainty and energy expenditure involved in deplaning and finding a gate and reboard in. This has its own worth. The aircraft that departs Sydney and lands in Dallas 18 hours later without interruption offer a continuity of experience that the connected itinerary cannot match. Inside those long-haul cabins, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, which enters commercial service in 2011, introduces changes to the cabin environment that are quieter than the seat revolution or the entertainment system, but that matter in direct physical terms to every passenger on board. The 787's composite fuselage allows a pressurization system that maintains a cabin altitude, the equivalent ground altitude that the cabin pressure corresponds to, lower than conventional aluminum aircraft can sustain. A conventional wide-body cruising at 38,000 feet typically maintains a cabin altitude of around 8,000 feet. The 787 can maintain a cabin altitude closer to 6,000 feet. This is not a number that means much in the abstract, but the human body responds to it. At 8,000 feet equivalent altitude, the air is noticeably thinner than at sea level, and passengers on long flights often feel the effects, the headaches, the fatigue, the particular kind of physical flatness that contributes to the general misery of a long flight taken in a conventional aircraft. At 6,000 feet, those effects are reduced. The body is less stressed. The experience is, in ways that are hard to articulate, but easy to feel, simply more comfortable. The 787 also maintains higher cabin humidity than conventional aircraft. Metal aircraft structures can suffer from corrosion if humidity levels are too high, so conventional aircraft keep cabin humidity very low, dry enough that passengers arrive from long flights with parched throats and irritated eyes. The Dreamliner's composite structure does not corrode, so humidity can be maintained at levels closer to what the human body actually prefers. These are changes that the passenger experiences not as a dramatic improvement, but as a subtle one. A sense that the flight was less wearing, that arrival felt a little better, that the hours in the cabin were somehow less harsh. But subtlety, in the context of aviation's relentless pursuit of improvement, is not the same as unimportance. By the middle of the 2010s, the global aviation network has reached a scale that its founders could not have imagined, and that even its recent participants find difficult to fully comprehend. More than 3.5 billion individual journeys are made by air each year. The network of scheduled routes connects every continent, reaches into cities and regions that a generation ago had no air service, and operates with a regularity and reliability that makes it, for many people in many parts of the world, simply a part of the expected infrastructure of modern life. A business person who needs to be in a different country tomorrow morning can, in most cases, arrange to be there. A family separated by emigration and distance can close that distance for a holiday or a crisis in a matter of hours. Students and researchers and artists and athletes move through the global network, crossing time zones in ways that their grandparents would have found extraordinary, as a normal feature of lives lived at a global scale. The network is not equally available to everyone. The economics of air travel, improved enormously since the Clipper era, lowered dramatically by the low-cost revolution, made accessible to a far wider population than ever before, still place regular flying beyond the reach of much of the world's population. The democratization that Tripp envisioned and the jet age began is real, but incomplete, a work in progress measured in decades. But the direction is clear. More people are flying. More routes exist. More of the world is reachable by air than was reachable 10 years before, or 20, or 50. The sky has never been so full. Let that fullness settle around you quietly. Somewhere above you right now, as you rest, there are aircraft at altitude, hundreds of them, thousands, crossing oceans and deserts and mountain ranges and open water, carrying their passengers through the night toward places those passengers need or want to be. The network does not sleep. The routes continue, the engines run, the navigation computers hold their courses. You are part of this story, in ways you may not always think about. Every flight you have ever taken is a thread in the fabric of what we have been describing tonight. This extraordinary, improbable, still unfinished project of connecting the world by air. Rest now. There is one more chapter waiting. The present and the future. The questions that aviation is still working to answer. But that can wait until you are ready. For now, let the sky be full and the cabin be quiet. Chapter 7: Recent Commercial Aviation Trends and the Future. Now, the story is still being written. Engineers speak quietly about electric propulsion, hydrogen fuel, sustainable flight. The sky is no longer the limit. It is simply the next chapter. We have come a long way tonight, from a wooden flying boat crossing Tampa Bay on a January morning in 1914, through the silver decades of the DC-3 and the thunder of the first jets, through the impossible scale of the jumbo era and the quiet digital revolution, and the global network that now spans every continent and carries billions of people through the sky each year. And now we arrive at the present, at the chapter that has no ending yet, because it is still being written, in engineering offices, and research laboratories and airline boardrooms and airport terminals around the world, by people who are asking the same fundamental question that Tony Janus asked when he climbed into the Benoist 14 and pointed it across Tampa Bay. What is possible, and how do we get there? The answer, as it has always been, is being worked out one careful step at a time. In the years just before 2020, commercial aviation stands at a kind of peak. Global passenger numbers have surpassed 4 billion individual journeys per year, a figure so large that it resists easy comprehension. 4 billion, more than half the population of the planet, boarding aircraft in a single year. The network is denser and more far-reaching than it has ever been. New routes are opening, new aircraft are being ordered. The trajectory of growth that has characterized aviation for most of its history shows no sign of reversing. And then, in the early months of 2020, something happens that no forecast had predicted and no continuity plan had adequately prepared for. The COVID-19 pandemic arrives. The effect on commercial aviation is immediate, total, and unlike anything the industry has experienced in its history. Previous crises, the oil shock of 1973, the aftermath of September 2001, the financial crisis of 2008, had reduced passenger numbers significantly, had grounded portions of fleets, had pushed airlines into financial difficulty. But they had not stopped flying. The pandemic stops flying. Governments close borders. Countries impose travel restrictions that make most international movement either impossible or subject to quarantine requirements so onerous that they effectively eliminate discretionary travel. Passengers who had bookings cancel them. Business travel, which accounts for a disproportionate share of airline revenue, evaporates almost entirely as meetings move to screens and offices empty. Among the busiest places on Earth fall quiet in ways that feel genuinely surreal to those who work in them. Aircraft that should be flying sit on tarmacs. Runways that should be active are still. Airlines that have been in continuous operation for decades face the prospect of running out of money within weeks. Some do not survive. Others survive only through government support of a scale that would have seemed unthinkable in ordinary times. Emergency lifelines extended by governments that understand that the aviation network, whatever its difficulties, is infrastructure too important to simply allow to collapse. The grounding is not absolute. Some flights continue, for repatriation, for essential travel, for the movement of medical supplies and personnel. But passenger aviation, as a global system, contracts to a fraction of its previous scale in a matter of weeks and remains there for months. And in that contraction, something else comes into focus. The cargo aircraft, the freighters that have always operated alongside the passenger fleet, but have never occupied the foreground of the aviation story, become, during the pandemic, suddenly and visibly essential. Medical equipment needs to move from the countries that manufacture it to the countries that need it. Once they are developed, need to move from production facilities to every populated place on Earth, in quantities and with temperature requirements that make the logistics operation one of the most demanding in history. Food supply chains that depend on air freight continue to need servicing. The global economy, even in lockdown, does not stop requiring things to move. Passenger aircraft, their cabins empty, and their economics destroyed are repurposed. Airlines that have never operated as freighters begin filling their passenger cabins with cargo, removing seats, stacking boxes in the spaces where people would have sat, operating routes as pure freight missions because the revenue from cargo is the only revenue available. It is an improvisation, ungainly and imperfect, but it works well enough to keep essential supply chains functioning through the worst months. The cargo operation during the pandemic is not a footnote in aviation history. It is a demonstration, visible to anyone who is paying attention, of what the aviation network actually is when its passenger function is stripped away. A system of extraordinary logistics capability, flexible enough to adapt, essential enough to continue, woven so deeply into the structure of the global economy that even a pandemic cannot simply turn it off. When the passenger network begins to recover, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as vaccination campaigns advance and restrictions ease, the fleet that returns to service is not quite the same fleet that was grounded. The pandemic has accelerated a retirement process that was already underway. The large four-engine jets, the 747s and the A380s and the A340s, that had been approaching the end of their economic lives before 2020, are now, in many cases, retired permanently rather than return to service. The economics of four-engine operation, already challenged by the efficiency of twin-engine wide-bodies, look even less compelling in a post-pandemic world, where airlines are managing reduced revenues and searching for every possible saving. The 747, which entered service in 1970, and which has been the defining image of wide-body aviation for half a century, retires from passenger service with most of the world's major carriers during and after the pandemic. It does not vanish entirely. It continues to fly as a freighter, and a handful of operators keep passenger versions in service. But its era as the dominant aircraft of long-haul aviation is over. The aircraft that carried more passengers across more oceans than any other machine in history makes its exit not with a ceremony, but with a gradual, practical, accountant-driven withdrawal. What replaces it is cleaner, quieter, more efficient, and less immediately imposing. The 787, the Airbus A350, the 777X, still in development, is the aircraft of the present and the near future. And its defining characteristic is not size, but economy. The fuel it does not burn, the emissions it does not produce, the cost per seat that it achieves. These are the metrics that matter now, in ways they did not quite matter before. Because aviation, as it recovers and looks toward its future, is confronting a question that it cannot defer indefinitely. The burning of jet fuel produces carbon dioxide. An aircraft at cruise altitude is burning fuel continuously, the same fuel that has powered commercial aviation since the first jets, refined from the same petroleum that the global economy has been extracting and burning for over a century. Aviation accounts for a meaningful fraction of global carbon emissions, and as the world's attention to the consequences of those emissions has intensified, the industry has come under pressure to account for its contribution and to chart a path toward reducing it. Sustainable aviation fuel, fuel derived from biological sources, from agricultural waste, from used cooking oil, from other feedstocks that are not petroleum offers one path. It can be buried in existing jet engines without modification, which means the transition does not require a new generation of aircraft. And when the full life cycle of its production is considered, the carbon absorbed by the plants from which it is made, offset against the carbon released when it burns, its net contribution to atmospheric carbon is dramatically lower than that of conventional jet fuel. The challenge is scale. The amount of sustainable aviation fuel currently being produced is a tiny fraction of what commercial aviation consumes. The production processes are more expensive than petroleum refining. The feedstocks are limited and compete with other uses. Scaling from the current demonstration quantities to something that can meaningfully replace conventional fuel across a global aviation network is an engineering and economic challenge of enormous complexity. But the testing is underway. Flights are being operated on sustainable fuel blends. Airlines are making commitments, some binding and some aspirational, to transition portions of their fuel consumption over coming decades. The direction is established, even if the path is long and the destination not yet clearly in sight. Beyond sustainable fuel, in the research facilities and startup offices and university engineering departments where the further future is being imagined, other possibilities are taking shape. Electric aircraft, vehicles powered by batteries rather than jet fuel, are limited for now by the fundamental constraint that batteries are heavy and jet fuel is energy dense in ways that current battery technology cannot match. A battery capable of storing enough energy to fly a large aircraft across an ocean would weigh so much that the aircraft could not carry it. The physics are clear, and they cannot be wished away. But for short-haul regional flying, flights of under an hour between cities close enough that the energy requirement is modest, the constraint is less severe. Small electric aircraft are already flying. Regional electric aircraft capable of carrying a dozen or 24 passengers over distances of a few hundred miles are in development at companies around the world. The certification challenges are significant. The infrastructure for charging at airports is largely non-existent, and the economics of the transition from existing turboprop regional aircraft are not yet clearly favorable. But they are being worked through, carefully and seriously, by people who understand that the regional aviation market, the short hops between smaller cities that form the periphery of the global network, is exactly where electric propulsion makes its first commercial sense. Hydrogen offers a different possibility and a different set of challenges. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. When burned in a jet engine or used in a fuel cell to generate electricity, its primary exhaust product is water vapor rather than carbon dioxide. In principle, an aircraft powered by hydrogen produces no carbon emissions at the point of use, though the full environmental accounting depends on how the hydrogen itself is produced. And currently, most hydrogen production involves processes that do emit carbon. The challenges are physical. Hydrogen is the lightest element, and storing enough of it to power an aircraft requires either very high pressure or very low temperature. Cryogenic tanks, maintained at temperatures approaching absolute zero, large and heavy, and requiring significant engineering attention. The aircraft that uses hydrogen fuel must be redesigned around those tanks in ways that conventional airliners are not. The airports that refuel it must have hydrogen infrastructure that does not currently exist anywhere in the commercial aviation system. Airbus has made public commitments to develop a hydrogen-powered commercial aircraft and has shown concept designs. The timeline is measured in decades rather than years. Direction is being pointed, and the engineering is beginning. At the other end of the speed spectrum, something else is quietly being reconsidered. Supersonic passenger travel. The ability to fly from New York to London in 3.5 hours, rather than 7, existed once, in the form of the Concorde, which operated from 1976 to 2003. The Concorde was extraordinary by any measure. A slender delta-winged aircraft that cruised at twice the speed of sound, at altitudes approaching 60,000 feet, carrying its 100 passengers across the Atlantic in the time it takes to drive from one end of a country to another. It was also expensive to operate, loud enough on takeoff to generate community resistance at every airport it used, and limited in route options by the sonic boom it produced over land, a boom powerful enough that supersonic flight over populated areas was restricted in most countries. The economics never fully worked. When it retired, it left behind no successor. But the technology has not stood still. New supersonic aircraft designs being developed by companies in the United States promise to address some of the Concorde's limitations. Quieter boom signatures, more fuel-efficient engines, business class rather than first-class pricing that might make the service commercially viable to a wider market. The certification challenges are substantial. The sonic boom question is not yet fully resolved. The fuel consumption at supersonic speeds remains considerably higher than subsonic equivalents. But the interest is real, the investment is real, and the question of whether supersonic passenger travel has a viable commercial future is being asked again, seriously, for the first time in decades. In the airports themselves, through these same years, the human transactions that have always been part of the travel experience are being quietly automated in ways that raise their own questions, even as they offer their own efficiencies. Biometric screening, the use of facial recognition or fingerprint scanning to verify a passenger's identity, is expanding through airports around the world. The technology can match a face to a passport photograph in seconds, confirm that the person at the gate is the person who holds the boarding pass, and process the transaction without the exchange of any document at all. The passenger looks at a camera. The camera looks back. A green light confirms the match. The gate opens. This is, from a throughput perspective, genuinely more efficient than the previous system. Long queues at document checkpoints shorten. The boarding process accelerates. The airport handles more passengers with less friction. But biometric data is not neutral data. It is intimate in ways that a passport number or a booking reference is not. For how long, with whom it is shared, and what purposes it might serve beyond the immediate verification of a passenger's identity, are questions that different countries and jurisdictions are answering in different ways, and that the traveling public is only beginning, as a general matter, to engage with. The technology will continue to expand. The questions will continue to need answering. Both things are true simultaneously. and the tension between them is one of the defining characteristics of aviation's present moment. And through all of it, the pandemic recovery, the sustainability pressure, the electric experiments, the biometric gates, the supersonic concepts, the network keeps growing. Commercial aviation today connects more cities than at any point in its history. Routes that did not exist 10 years ago now carry regular traffic. Regions that were poorly served now have direct connections to major hubs. The map of the world as drawn by aviation is denser, more complete, more granular in its coverage of the planet's inhabited surface than it has ever been. This matters in ways that go beyond the convenience of individual journey. A's. The places that are connected by aviation are connected to everything that aviation connectivity brings, to tourism and trade, to the movement of ideas and people and skills, to the possibility of presence in places that distance would otherwise make unreachable. The towns and cities and regions that are on the aviation map occupy a different position in the global economy than those that are not. And as the network grows, as more places come onto the map, the world becomes, in the old and simple and still accurate phrase, smaller. Not smaller in its problems, or its distances, or its complexity. Smaller in the sense that more of it is reachable. More of it is available. More of it is for more people genuinely close. We began tonight on a grass field in Florida. A wooden aircraft, a single passenger, 23 minutes across a bay. And we have arrived here, at a world where 4 billion journeys are made by air each year, where aircraft fly non-stop from one side of the planet to the other, where the engineering that carries us is as sophisticated as any technology our civilization has produced, and where the next chapter, cleaner, quieter, faster, more connected still, is already being written. The story of commercial aviation is not a story about aircraft, not really. It is a story about a persistent human refusal to accept that distance is permanent, that the horizon is a limit, that the sky belongs only to the birds and the weather. It is a story about the particular kind of stubbornness that looks at an impossible thing and says, not impossible, just not done yet. Tony Janis believed it. The DC-3's designers believed it. The engineers who built the 747, and the pilots who flew the Clipper, and the flight attendants who kept their composure in turbulence, and the air traffic controllers who managed the crowded sky, and the researchers who are right now, in laboratories somewhere, working on the hydrogen problem, and the battery problem, and the sonic boom problem. They all believed the same thing, that the next departure is always possible, that the destination is always worth reaching, that the sky, however full it has become, still has room for what comes next. Let that thought carry you gently into sleep. The aircraft is at altitude. The engines are steady. The cabin is quiet and dark. And outside the oval windows, the stars are close and unwavering. And somewhere far below the lights of the city are tracing the familiar shapes of a world that is tonight a little more connected than it was yesterday, and will be a little more connected still tomorrow. You have traveled a long way tonight, through more than a century of flight, through all the invention and ambition and loss and achievement, that the history of commercial aviation contains. Rest now. The flight is complete, as it always has been. Continues.